Hey, and welcome to the video where today we'll be discussing reducing extraneous processing. Our objective for this video will be to identify 3 different principles for reducing extraneous processing and explain how they work. The first principle we'll be covering is the signaling principle. With the signaling principle, what you would do is you would create a visual cue for students on the screen so that they can see very clearly what it is that you're discussing or where you would like their attention to be. This helps cut down on the extraneous load and a student's working memory by pointing them exactly to where they need to be, as opposed to them trying to figure out on their own where you might be at on a slide or a video or anything like that. The next principle we'll talk about is the redundancy principle. With the redundancy principle, we want to focus on not saying exactly what we wrote on screen. When we say exactly what we write and we're just essentially reading what we write, what ends up happening is that students are reading what's up on the screen, they're listening to what we're saying, it's all the exact same information, so students are dedicating twice the amount of processing to essentially get the same amount of content. That's creating a lot of extraneous processing for the learner. We can cut pretty much about most of that in half by just not saying exactly what we wrote. Our final principle that we're going to cover is the coherence principle. With the coherence principle, what we should focus on is removing any content in our lessons that does not directly pertain to the lesson that we're teaching. If we're teaching something that reminds us of something that we did in real life, reminds us of a movie, reminds us of a book, we should avoid talking about that. When we're creating slides, we should avoid adding in pictures that really aren't directly related to what we're talking about. And we should probably reduce the amount of pictures we put up on screen as much as possible and only put up the important pieces of information that students need to learn. By focusing everything down and removing anything that can be considered irrelevant information and irrelevant content, what we do is we remove all that irrelevant stuff that students would be processing in their working memory and make it so that they can simply focus on the tasks and information that we would like them to learn. In the following couple of slides, I'll teach a short lesson on third-person narration where I'll be using the signaling, redundancy, and coherence principle. So please pay attention as I go through this and see if you can see how I'm following these principles in my lesson. Next will be the third-person narration. In third-person narration, the narrator is an outside source who is telling us this story that we're reading. A third-person narrator is not going to be a character in the story. It's more so somebody who is observing a story and sharing it with us. Because of that, they won't be including themselves in the story, so they'll be using pronouns that refer to the other characters and do not refer to themselves. For example, they'll be using pronouns such as he, she, they, and them. Now, there are many different types of third-person narrators, as opposed to with first and second person, which are just first and second person. The first one we'll talk about is third-person objective. This is where a narrator can only really share what they can see and hear themselves if they were there personally. This is more so used in things like news stories, and it's not so much used with fictional literature. Our final two that we'll talk about is third-person limited and omniscient. Third-person limited is very similar to first-person in that the narrator is limited to only knowing the thoughts and feelings of the main character. Even though the narrator is not this character, he'll still be able to essentially know what that person is thinking, and we'll be able to go through that character's thought processes. However, the narrator is only limited to that main character. This is compared to third-person omniscient narrator, where the narrator can know the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters. For example, if our story has 2 main characters, we are probably going to have a third-person omniscient narrator who can read the thoughts and feelings of both those main characters. Or we might have a third-person omniscient narrator who knows the thoughts and feelings of every character in the story. When deciphering the difference between these types of narrators, we need to stop and think. Am I being given information about characters outside of the dialogue? Do I know what this character is thinking? Do I know what they're feeling? And do I know that information for more than one character? If we can identify that we only know it for one character, it's likely going to be limited. If we can tell that we're getting all that information for multiple characters, it's likely going to be omniscient. So let's look back at these two slides that I just taught. How did I use signaling? Well, up on screen, I would point students towards what I was talking about and important, relevant pieces of information of what I was talking about. It helped guide students to parts that they can read that helped highlight the larger lesson that I was talking about. When we had the redundancy principle, I did not read everything directly from the screen. What was written up on screen is more so highlights of my overall verbal lesson. And when it comes to the coherence principle, I did not overload the screens with irrelevant pictures, and I did not talk about irrelevant content. I did not bring up other stories. I did not bring up I did not go on tangents when I talked, and the pictures were very simple visual representations that they can associate with the content that I taught.